Let us pray. As Canadians and as Albertans, we give thanks for the precious gifts of freedom and peace which we enjoy. As members of this Legislative Assembly, we rededicate ourselves to the valued traditions of parliamentary democracy as a means of serving our province and our country. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill 55, being NOVA, and Alberta Corporation Amendment Act 1987. And Mr. Speaker, this bill is an important bill in terms of the corporation, NOVA Corporation, which is one of the more dynamic, widely diversified corporations operating in Alberta. The company in its history, Mr. Speaker, was incorporated some 30 or more years ago, and at that time the share structure in particular was certainly suitable at the time, but now in consideration of the current financial times needs to be updated. And this legislation, Mr. Speaker, deals with several important elements of restructuring the shareholders of that corporation, in particular providing more contemporary specific voting rights to the Class A shareholders. Those shares that you and I and our mothers and fathers bought many years ago now will have the full voting rights similar to all other Class A shares. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, because this corporation is so significant to the diversification of the Alberta economy, it is the feeling of the government that the legislation, the Nova Corporation Act itself, should provide very specific protections to ensure that the company is head officed here in Alberta and that the Lieutenant Governor and Council has an opportunity to appoint key and specific directors to that board. And at the same time, to maintain the Alberta character of this important diversified company, those protections are implicit in the legislation. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, because there are other kinds of protections necessary, the legislation provides that a 15% voting protection shall accrue to the owner of the company as well. That is to say that you shall not vote more than 15% of the shares. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is important for the corporation because it takes it to some extent out from underneath the legislation of the NOVA Act and transfers part of the day-to-day operations into the Business Corporation Act. So, Speaker, this is an important day for the corporation. You may note that the leadership of the company has been outstanding in Canadian context. In your gallery, Mr. Speaker, are three of the important people who have provided that leadership, and I move first reading of this legislation, of this Act, Bill 55, Mr. Speaker.
Having heard the motion by the Provincial Treasurer for first reading of Bill 55, NOVA and Alberta Corporation Amendment Act 1987. Those willing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Motion carries.
Bill 55, being NOVA and Alberta Corporation Amendment Act 1987, introduced by Honourable Mr. Johnston, is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports. Introduction of special guests.
Member for Highwood.
Mr. Speaker, in years gone by, I have been honored to have introduced to you and my colleagues many delightful guests. I don't suppose in all my time that I have ever been so proud as I am this minute to have the privilege and pleasure to introduce to you and all members of the Legislative Assembly 170 magnificent senior citizens from all parts of the province of Alberta. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, and Mr. Speaker, your galleries are filled with pioneers, the men and women who showed the way, and we are pleased today to delightfully receive them in the confines of this legislature as Senior Citizens Week gets underway. Mrs. Alice Modine is the perpetrator of Senior Citizens Week and deserves special recognition, as does Mrs. Ramsey, a retired public health nurse who is now 100 years old, living in her own home and showing us by example the very theme which we are emphasizing. our Minister of Social Services, Connie Osterman, under whose guiding hand we operate, and the Senior Citizens Advisory Council, and the Senior Citizens Secretariat, directed by Mary Engelman and her assistants, Lottie Germanick, Wanda Cree, Louise Hessian, and Alice Gray, and the Senior Citizens Advisory Council, Marilyn Daines, Betty Purvis, Bob Kernahan, and Ed Fee, would like to remind the rest of the world that our senior citizens aren't here to see what the province will do for them, but rather they would like to show us what they can do for the province. Mr. Speaker, I would now ask that all our guests in the galleries please rise and accept the warmest plaudits ever given in the history of this Legislative Assembly.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct the first question to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Premier marred an otherwise successful meeting in Ottawa last week with essentially idle and ill-considered threat regarding Alberta separatism. To make matters worse from the perspective of Albertans, I believe the Premier said in his return that the threat of separatism was actually a bargaining ploy for which he would not apologize given the size of the legislative majority. My question to the Premier, I wonder if the Premier has since had sober second thoughts about this particular remark, given that there is no conceivable circumstance under which he has a mandate, in his words, to pull us out of this bloody country.
No, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, that's very interesting. So the Premier thinks that he has a mandate to pull us out of the country. But I wonder about that comment and that sort of answer, Mr. Speaker. It gets stranger and stranger because he used an example, the prospect of a constitutional amendment relating to Aboriginal rights as the reason that he would pull us out of the bloody country. My question is, the Premier not aware of the profound impact of this statement to the Native peoples in Alberta? Has he thought about the message he sent to the Native peoples in Alberta?
Mr. Speaker, I think there was 3 questions there, and the answer is no, no, and yes.
Mr. Speaker, that may be, the backbenchers may find that flippant and funny, but the people of Alberta don't, nor do the Native peoples of Alberta. My question is, I don't understand then how the Premier can say that he's for the Accord. Just follow the logic here, backbenchers. He says he's for the Accord. He's for the Accord, but yet he's invited Quebec in, and they follow under the previous amending. It's more likely now that they're going to get their rights because of that. Is the Premier not aware of that?
I didn't even hear a question in that participation by the honourable member.
Maybe if the backbenchers would listen, they might learn something and you could hear the question. My question is the Premier, prior to the Constitutional Accord, Quebec made a practice not to enter negotiations. Now they are a full partner. Is the Premier not aware that the entrenchment of Aboriginal rights is a greater possibility now that Quebec is a member? Because the negative players, Alberta, BC, and Newfoundland, may now lose their vote over this particular matter.
Mr. Speaker, the province of Alberta is not against Native rights or Aboriginal rights. All we asked is that before they be entrenched in the Constitution, that we first determine what that means.
Supplementary question, Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier is improving anyhow. He doesn't claim he's misquoted, but could the Premier let us know whether or not view the different opinions expressed by the member of the opposition and his own threat from time to time when he gets peeved and threatens to pick up his football and go home? Would he consider now having public hearings on the Accord?
We are, Mr. Speaker, here in this legislature.
Your second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
I'd like to direct the second of my question designated to the member from Edmonton Centre, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, this being Senior Citizens Week, I have some questions for the Minister of Hospitals and Medical Care about what I find to be the most glaring example of the Conservative government's mismanagement of the hospital system, which is to say that amidst all of the hospital building and beds that have been built over the last 10 years, little concern has been set on the priority for long-term care beds and elderly who need to be placed in auxiliary hospitals. So that now, Mr. Speaker, we're told by the Central Placement Office that 512 elderly are awaiting placement in long-term care beds in this province. And now to aggravate this, the Minister of Hospitals and Medical Care has announced that seniors in active treatment hospitals will no longer be eligible for preferred accommodation in those hospitals. What possible justification does the Minister have for making life even more miserable for those senior citizens whom his government's policies have consigned to the placement in the institution that is not appropriate for their care?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, with respect to the number of auxiliary hospital beds and nursing home beds, particularly in the city of Edmonton, the honourable member should know that we concluded an agreement last February with the Edmonton General Hospital Board, wherein that board will take over the operation of the Millwoods Hospital, opening at its full 450-odd beds, and the Edmonton General Hospital will then be converted largely to an extended care auxiliary hospital with a world-class geriatric care center that's second to none in North America. That will add some 348 auxiliary beds for patients in Edmonton. In addition to that, I had the pleasure a few weeks ago of announcing a complete rebuild of the St. Joseph's Auxiliary Hospital on the south side of Edmonton, and also announcing that the Allen Gray Auxiliary Hospital will be expanded from 48 beds to 100 beds. There are also discussions going on with the Chinese community right now with respect to the possibility that we might be involved in assisting them in developing two major long-term care centers, both a nursing home and auxiliary, or a nursing home and lodge type facility. So there is a lot going on in Edmonton to relieve the situation of seniors staying in active treatment hospitals that have been assessed for auxiliary care. We're not unmindful of the need to do that, and we've taken some very concrete action. With regard to the preferred accommodation benefits, which were provided under Blue Cross, the honourable member should be aware, I'm sure all seniors are, that if a senior is in an active treatment hospital and medically requires a private room, then that will be provided at no cost to the senior, and that has been the case for a number of years. If, on the other hand, the senior, or any other person for that matter, wishes to have a private room and it's not a medical requirement, then there would be an extra charge for that levied by the hospital. That extra charge is in the order of $20 a day. It's well below what the average charge is for those kinds of rooms. If you're into the United States and other parts of the world, you'll find charges well in excess of $200 or $300 a day for private rooms. So for the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, to suggest that this government is not doing a great deal with respect to providing active treatment, hospital accommodation, auxiliary accommodation, and nursing home care for seniors is just so much baloney. There's a lot being done, and it's being done in cooperation with seniors, and in all cases, I think, with their support and encouragement.
Mr. Speaker, such an announcement should have been made 5 or 10 years ago, not in 1987 here in Alberta today. So, to answer the question, is the minister now saying that a dear elderly friend of mine who's been in the Misericordia for over a year now, waiting placement in long-term care, is going to be yanked out of her preferred accommodation, which I think she well deserves, and be put into ward accommodation where she has to share a toilet and other things with 4 other people for who knows how many months longer?
Well, the situation, Mr. Speaker, is that as soon as people have been assessed for auxiliary care and they're residing in an active treatment hospital, they're placed on the list of the Central Placement Office, District Number 24, and they then are, as soon as a bed is available, placed in an auxiliary hospital. I would be pleased to have the details of the honourable member's friend who's been over a year in the Misericordia Hospital and see if, in fact, there's some problem with that individual and with respect to the name not being on the list for auxiliary care. There are not that many patients who've been residing in active treatment hospitals at that length of time. That's, I think, rather unusual. I'd have to say to the honourable member as well that the care that's given in that hospital, whether it be in a 4-bed ward, a 2-bed ward, or a private ward, is, in my view, very good care. In fact, some of the best in North America coming from that hospital. If the honourable member again has complaints or concerns about the kind of care that's given by the staff of that hospital, I'd be pleased to review those as well.
Mr. Speaker, the point is that she's in a misplaced institution of care. Will the minister please advise this assembly how these elderly people who are blocked in these beds in active treatment hospitals can retain preferred accommodation if they so wish and deserve, despite his fact sheet, which says that the Blue Cross will be picking up, or you've had discussions that Blue Cross will be picking this up, this preferred accommodation cost, when in fact Blue Cross does not now, nor has any plans in the future to provide extended benefits for preferred accommodation for any elderly people. This fact sheet, then, Mr. Speaker, is misleading.
I've been unable to detect the question, if there was one.
Mr. Speaker, the minister's fact sheet says that seniors in this kind of situation can pick up the coverage from Blue Cross, when in fact Blue Cross has said that they will not now, nor in the future, look at such preferred accommodation. How is it, therefore, that this sheet is not inaccurate?
Well, Mr. Speaker, Blue Cross does have a separate coverage package available. It does include the provision of private or single accommodation in the hospital system. The problem is that they don't sell that separately, just for seniors. And we've asked Blue Cross if they would look into the possibility of developing a separate program of providing insurance coverage just for seniors for private accommodation. The reaction that I had and staff of my department as well as Blue Cross is that it would likely not be called upon very often because few people would buy insurance for coverage of a private room that was not medically required, and if they require the private room for medical reasons, then of course there's no charge. That's borne by the Department of Hospitals and Medical Care. In addition to that, as I said earlier, at least probably 75% of the average costs of a private bed is still paid for by the hospital because the extra charge is very, very nominal as compared to the real cost. So one could see, Mr. Speaker, that with the benefits that there are there, there's likely little call for that additional insurance. However, we've asked Blue Cross to consider it, and they're in the process of doing that at the moment.
Revire, supplementary, followed by Calgary Buffalo.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question. The minister, in the minister's ongoing study to convert some of the small rural hospitals, some of their beds into long-term care, can the minister indicate what progress is being made in that line to try and cut down the cost as well as provide auxiliary care in the rural areas?
Well, we've had a number of inquiries since I wrote to all hospital board chairmen earlier this year advising them of a new policy that would allow the conversion of active treatment beds in multiples of not less than 5 to auxiliary care or nursing home care. So we've had a number of inquiries, and boards are now considering, working with our department, how they might best do that, and I hope that by the end of the year we'll be able to say that a number have went in that direction. But so far, most of the boards are considering the matter, studying whether or not it fits in their hospital, and they'll be making a decision later on this year.
Calgary Buffalo, supplementary question.
Would the minister advise us to the government's position on day program proposals being made by groups across the province, such as the Kirby Centre in Calgary and the Alzheimer's Society, which would enable more seniors to stay in their homes and help their families in light of the long overdue need for these types of programs in this province?
Certainly, Mr. Speaker, both the Minister of Community Occupational Health and I have had numerous discussions about the operations of day hospitals, day treatment programs, along with home care programs, and believe very strongly that there's a great deal more that the system can and should do to try to treat treat as opposed to caring for, but to treat patients in a hospital-type setting or a day program setting where the costs are much less than institutional care. There's no question about it. That's a trend that we want to encourage as much as possible because it will allow people to stay in their own homes and at the same time receive treatment. While we're considering that, though, we must be careful that we don't just substitute the family caring that goes on often for seniors with a government paid-for program. We must make certain that whatever we do is in the form of treatment rather than simply care that replaces some family care that is now there and should continue to be there.
Member for Westlock Sturgeon, followed by Clover Bar.
Mr. Speaker, my question today is to the Minister of Education. The latest estimates have shown that over 3,000 teaching positions in the province may be lost because of the cuts in education funding. And the Minister has stated, Mr. Speaker, a number of times that she would welcome a debate on the feasibility of early retirement plans for teachers. To the Minister, can the Minister tell the House whether she has instructed her department to investigate and report to her on the relative merits of early retirement plan for teachers?
Not specifically, Mr. Speaker. I have certainly put in place a monitoring mechanism as to how boards are effecting a reduction plan within their own jurisdiction, however.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary then to the Minister. A little disappointed not more has been done, but maybe could she tell the House whether she has discussed with the ATA, the Alberta Teachers Association, who are in favor of such a plan and are quite knowledgeable and have a plan. Has she had discussions with the ATA?
The matter of early retirement comes up in many different forums, Mr. Speaker. And certainly, as I've noted in the House on several occasions, several school boards have in fact put in place a form of early retirement program. If the honourable member is suggesting that the province institute an early retirement program for professions affected within the public sector, perhaps he would like to put a motion on the order paper.
Mr. Speaker, we probably will do just that. We certainly pursue it a little farther, but I was exploring, Mr. Speaker, just how much the minister has kept up on that. Is she aware, for instance, that a teacher in the highest end of the top end of the pay scale makes $17,000 more a year than a new teacher just coming out of school? That's enough to pay out the pension and actually save any. Has she done any cost-benefit analysis or cost analysis on that?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure if the honourable member is suggesting that we link educational funding to the teachers within the system or the accommodation of new teachers in the system. Certainly I have said within this legislature that I think it's very important that we continue to provide opportunities for new graduating and energetic young teachers, but I am certainly pleased to note that we have excellent teachers in this province and also the youngest and the best educated teachers in this province compared to the rest of Canada.
Mr. Speaker, I find the minister's logic very hard to follow. She says she's trying to provide employment for beginning teachers. Yet is she not aware that she cut the training program that the boards used, the teachers from the training program for teachers that were used to help educate disabled students and students that were special education problems? So she did two things with her acts. She not only made less jobs for new teachers.
Honourable member, the question was asked. Order. The question was asked in the first sentence. It's supplementary questions. We're not into representations or answers. Minister of Education.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, I didn't hear a question in that last question.
Mr. Speaker, the question is, how can she say she's doing things to help young teachers get jobs when she's done away with the new graduate teacher training program, which the boards used to help teach disabled students?
Mr. Speaker, again, the honourable leader of the Liberal Party is linking the best use of educational dollars with the number of jobs that are available within the system. In my view, the most important use of educational dollars is to ensure that students learn and to build within a system of learning a quality which is certainly contributed to by teachers, but not in the first instance is the number of teachers the most important use of those educational dollars.
Clover Bar, followed by Edmonton Avonmore.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question to the Minister of Education. In light of the fact that our dollars are getting tighter and we have a surplus of teachers and our physical plants are costing more, is the Minister's Department looking at the possibility of going on a 12-year school system and looking at the semester system so that we use the physical plants longer and possibly provide more jobs for teachers?
Mr. Speaker, that debate has certainly been raised in several quarters of this province. I'm not sure that it means we would be spending the dollars more effectively. It may be a more efficient use of those dollars, and certainly I will be looking at the debate that ensues publicly on the matter.
Edmonton Avonmore.
To the Minister of Education, in view of her commitment to teaching opportunities for new teachers and qualified teachers, would she consider reinstituting the Initiation to Teaching program?
Mr. Speaker, this legislature passed the Appropriation Act on Friday by royal assent, and included in that was the budget plan of the Department of Education, which will stay for the 87-88 fiscal year. Certainly, the Initiation to Teaching project was an excellent program. We are doing an evaluation with members of the faculties of education in two of the faculties of education in Alberta, and I think the results of that will show ways in which we can bridge more effectively the gap between the teacher in the university environment and the teacher in the classroom, and certainly I will be looking at those kinds of models in the future.
Clover Bar, followed by Edmonton Mill Woods, followed by supplementary. Calgary McKnight.
I'd like to ask the Honourable Minister, in view of the very large proportion of salaries that makes up the school board's budget throughout the province, and in view of the ongoing concern of the provincial treasury to reduce our deficit, could she assure us that she would make her best efforts to try and get more money from the treasurer to bring in a significant retirement program that would help the school boards throughout the province get over this problem of too much staff at too high a price?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable member from Calgary McKnight can make his own representations effectively to the provincial treasurer. As we have stated, the issue of early retirement within the school boards affecting teachers is one which school boards have addressed in the past and I'm sure will continue to address in the future.
Clover Bar, followed by Edmonton Mill Woods, followed by Edmonton Meadowlark.
My question is to the Minister of Energy. In the late 60s and the early 70s, we used to have a thing in this province called 30-year rolling reserve for natural gas before we could sell any across the border. To the Minister, what is the government's policy on that so-called rolling reserve, and what is the duration of that policy?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the ERCB and the National Energy Board continue to monitor the reserves that are in place in this country and this province. And the ERCB recently came out with a report which indicated that the picture is very bright in terms of the reserves that we have in place for natural gas. Some 61 trillion cubic feet, which is approximately a 26-year supply. Because of the natural gas deregulation and the national surplus test of 25 years being a barrier to our producers having access to the U.S. market, in our agreement we had between the federal government and ourselves and the other two western provinces of British Columbia and Saskatchewan, there was a request for the National Energy Board to review their surplus tests, and they came out with a 15-year reserves over production test a year ago, which was not satisfactory to the provinces or to the supplier or the producers in this province, in this country. And thus we tentatively agreed to proceed with deregulation on condition that the National Energy Board review that surplus test again. And those hearings are in the process of being completed, and it would be to the benefit of the gas industry in this province and this country if we have a significant improvement in that surplus test to reflect to a great degree the surplus test that is in place in this province right now with the ERCB is some 15-year supply into the core market, which matches the contracts that are in place in that market. And so one of the conditions of deregulation was having access to the U.S. market with a considerable reduction in the umbrella surplus test requirements, but in place of that we have long-term contracts.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question to the Minister. In these so-called reserves, what differentiation is there between shallow reserves and deep reserves?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in terms of determining the surplus tests, there is no distinction made between the two that I'm aware of. What the ERCB does is look at the overall requirements for the province and applying their reserve tests to gas removal permits. We receive those gas removal permits and approve them either at ministerial level or the cabinet level for gas to be removed out of the province. I mentioned earlier in my first response, Mr. Speaker, that the picture is looking very bright in terms of having access to the U.S. market with their gas bubble going down. The recent discovery at Caroline with some 2 trillion cubic feet of reserves there, I think the picture is looking very bright in terms of the future of the gas industry in this province.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister, what protection is there in place for the Alberta user? As a businessman, I presume that I would sell the cheap gas first and keep the more expensive gas in reserve. What protection is there for Albertans 20 years down the road that we as Albertans will not have to use that more expensive natural gas?
Well, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the removal of gas from the province, we have our royalties, which are different for old gas and for new gas. The ERCB is constantly monitoring the supplies in both areas. But in terms of any distinction between holding them back on the part of the producers, I'm not aware of any concerns that have been expressed in that particular area. I would simply add that in terms of the protection for the consumers in this province, we have that 15-year supply in place for the consumers in this province into the core market. And with natural gas deregulation, the industry has agreed that, along with the governments in this country, that in the industrial markets, that competition there should determine what the natural gas prices are in competition with fuel oil and other forms of energy. However, in the core market for the residential homeowner, for schools or hospitals, we have the assurance of a long-term supply, not only in terms of the surplus test, but in terms of contracting that long-term supply between the distributors and the producers in this province.
Calgary Forest Lawn, followed by Calgary Buffalo. Supplementaries.
Mr. Speaker, a supplemental to the Minister of Energy. I wonder if the Minister could give us some approximation of what percentage of that gas that's currently being sold at distressed prices into the U.S. market is bringing any royalty to the Alberta Treasury.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we constantly monitor the price of natural gas, and one of the conditions of deregulation that instead of a border pricing test be in place, that we have a quarterly review of the prices of natural gas going into the United States. And the last information that we received from our own ERCB and the Alberta Petroleum Marketing Commission was that the average price of natural gas going into the United States is higher than the average domestic ex-Alberta price. In other words, we are still selling gas into the United States at a higher price on the average than we are into provinces outside of Alberta.
Okay. Calgary Buffalo.
Is it, to the Minister, is it the Minister's policy to attempt to end the 15-year supply reserve rules that we have at the present time, which in fact make a mockery and really a charade of deregulation, or will he accept the fact that complete deregulation was foolish and impossible to begin with?
Well, I'm not sure how the honourable member connects the last part with the first part of the question that he asked. The honourable member knows full well that we entered into the process of deregulation with the agreement of the industry, federal government, and all the provincial governments that were signatories to that particular agreement. And we all, including the industry, agree that deregulation is the objective that we want, and we're working towards that objective. And so it was not a mistake. In fact, it was only during a time of a surplus situation that we believed that we could get an agreement on deregulation. And as soon as that U.S. market opens up and other barriers are removed, I think all Canadians will benefit from natural gas deregulation.
Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Mr. Speaker, my question today is for the Minister for Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs. Recently, we received reports of a development project funded by the Alberta Agency for International Development being seriously disrupted by the American-backed Contras. This project in Mount-Cotel was sponsored by two Alberta agencies, Farmers for Peace and Change for Children, and Assisted Peasants in Resettlement. To the Minister, what action has he taken to convey to the American administration the grave concern of the people and the government of Alberta about these terrorist actions that are destroying the excellent work done by Alberta non-government organizations with the assistance of Alberta Aid?
Mr. Speaker, that matter was dealt with by the Right Honourable Joe Clark, Minister of State for External Affairs, on behalf of all Canadians. I was in Ottawa last week when he made his representations.
Supplementary question then. In 86-87, Mr. Speaker, Alberta Aid funded 15 projects in Nicaragua for a total of $309,000. So surely we have to be very concerned about these kinds of incidents. I would ask the Minister, has he, when he was talking to the federal minister, or will he now urge him strongly to send a protest note to the American ambassador about these outrages?
Mr. Speaker, that was done by the Right Honourable Joe Clark, as I indicated in a note to the Secretary of State of the United States, Mr. Schultz.
Supplementary question to the Minister. Would he be prepared to write to the President of Nicaragua, Mr. Ortega, to express the concern of the people and the government of Alberta about the development projects supported by the people in the province of Alberta in his country?
Mr. Speaker, representations of that kind obviously should go from the federal government to any government with which we have relations. I would leave it in the hands of the federal government to deal with.
Leave anything else in their hands if you have your way.
And it's hardly provincial.
To the Minister for Economic Development and Trade, Mr. Speaker, since the Alberta Aid budget was slashed in half, leaving many Albertans to wonder whether or not this government is still interested in international development, can the Minister assure the House and all Albertans if Alberta Aid will continue to support development projects in Nicaragua and give those projects priority?
Mr. Speaker, our international aid program is by far the best in Canada. As a matter of fact, the total government contribution toward international aid is more than that contributed by all other provinces combined. Mr. Speaker, the decision with respect to whether or not contributions are made to non-governmental organizations supporting projects in Nicaragua or any other country is not a decision that's made by the government. It's one that's made by the contributors who make the contribution to the non-governmental organization that we in turn support.
Westlock Surgeon, supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister of Economic Development and Trade, would he have at his fingertips the amount of trade or amount of business we do with Nicaragua as far as selling Alberta products and how much we might import from there each year?
No, I don't, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The member for Calgary, Glenmore, followed by Edmonton Meadowlark, followed by Edmonton Belmont.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Hospitals and Health Care, last week in Calgary, the Calgary Area Hospital Advisory Council met to discuss a report done by a group of consultants regarding pediatric and obstetrical beds. Apparently, this report suggested the moving of the Children's Hospital to Foothills. Can the Minister tell me if he will follow up on this recommendation or if this report is in fact true?
Mr. Speaker, there were two parts to the report. The first one suggested that there should be a move of the the Alberta Children's Hospital, rather, in Calgary to the Foothills Hospital site, and the second part of the report dealt with more lengthy recommendations as to what to do in the event that the hospital is not relocated. I presently have under consideration the second part of the report dealing with some consolidation of pediatric beds and programs at the Children's Hospital on its present location. I had previously said and would reiterate again that the Children's Hospital will not be moved to the Foothills Hospital site.
Would the Minister consider a second opinion before making his final decision in the implementation of the Children's Hospital?
The latest report, Mr. Speaker, was actually the third opinion, and it too is rejected.
Entry.
What is the short-term plan regarding the pediatric and obstetrical bed problem?
Well, the recommendation from the Calgary Hospital Planning Council is that we consolidate the major pediatric services in the Children's Hospital, that there remain some limited services at the Foothills Hospital, and that the new Peter Lougheed Hospital have a 20-bed pediatric ward, and that the new Rocky View Hospital have a 20-bed pediatric ward. That would be some considerable consolidation over what presently exists. And while I'm not yet in a position to say that we can accept those recommendations, they do fall very much in line with our stated desire to have hospitals in our two major cities minimize as much as possible the duplication of very expensive intensive care programs and programs like pediatric care. So generally, Mr. Speaker, the recommendations of the Council I think will be looked upon favorably, but I want to have more opportunity to consider them before making the final decision.
The Calgary Buffalo supplementary.
The word I get from Calgary, Mr. Speaker, is that there is tremendous pressure on the outpatient diagnostic services at the Calgary Children's Hospital, particularly in light of looming cutbacks with respect to learning disabilities in the public school system. Is the minister aware of these problems, and if he isn't, will he undertake to look into this in order to ensure that adequate services continue to be available to treat handicapped children and those with learning disabilities at the Calgary Children's Hospital?
Mr. Speaker, very much aware. I had extensive meetings with the Board of Management and the directors of the Children's Hospital in Calgary prior to them making final decisions this year on the manner in which they would meet current budgetary targets. Indeed, the board was very responsible in making a good portion of their expenditure reductions in areas of administration and in areas that would not affect the care of children. As a matter of fact, there's one or two areas where there's been an expansion of their present system in order to accommodate additional patients. The Alberta Children's Hospital in Calgary, in terms of its total operating costs, has the largest budgetary component involved in outpatient care of any hospital in Alberta, with the possible exception of the Cross Cancer Institute, located both in Edmonton and Calgary. That will continue. I have to say, though, that the hospital will not have the budgetary revenue that might be necessary to accommodate significant cutbacks in the public education system in Calgary or anywhere else. We would hope, therefore, that the education system would continue to fund, as it has in the past, those areas which it is responsible for without pushing the load onto the Children's Hospital.
Edmonton Centre, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the Minister's operating and capital constraints, when is he going to make good on the Premier's campaign promise to build a second children's hospital, one in northern Alberta?
The consolidation of pediatric services in Edmonton to serve northern Alberta under one roof is something that every member in northern Alberta ought to be striving very hard to achieve. Firstly, because it will provide to us a great deal better pediatric care than we presently have for northern Alberta. And secondly, if we are to consolidate beds in one area and reduce the number of beds that exist throughout many hospitals in the province or in the capital city now, we will be able to, if not save money, at least for the same amount of money, give much better pediatric care. So I'm looking forward, Mr. Speaker, even though the member from Edmonton Centre may not be, of the day when we have a Northern Alberta Children's Hospital.
Edmonton Meadowlark, and if there's time, Edmonton Belmont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to the Treasurer, Albertans are extremely worried about the management of the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Among other things, they are concerned about the rate of return that they're getting and the quality of those returns, those interest returns on the fund. A case in point is the $3.5 billion investment in Alberta Mortgage and Housing Corporations. Could the Treasurer please confirm that the Alberta Mortgage and Housing Corporation paid about $420 million of interest to the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund 1985-86, or about 25% of the entire earnings of the fund came from this single corporation?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd be glad to comment about the importance of the Heritage Savings Trust Fund and the way in which the Heritage Savings Trust Fund has enabled us to pursue particularly important objectives during intervals in our economic history, one of them being the need to assist and to provide a major stimulus to housing in this province. What is often forgotten, Mr. Speaker, when comparing the Heritage Savings Trust Fund is the significant amount of money that has in fact been earned within that fund. Some $8 billion has been transferred from the Heritage Savings Trust Fund to the General Revenue Fund over the past few years. But as well, Mr. Speaker, you must realize that it was a tool of economic diversification and used to support a particular initiative at the time. And let's recall that housing, Mr. Speaker, in the mid-1970s was a particular problem. And we responded in that diversification, which generated jobs, provided economic growth, and responded to a social need, Mr. Speaker, by using that fund for that purpose. Mr. Speaker, for that reason, the investment in the Alberta Housing and Mortgage Corporation is a significant investment. Mr. Speaker, the member knows that there will be a great opportunity here in the next few days when the resolution for additional money for the Heritage Fund is before us, and I'm sure he can bring those questions, and I'll have an opportunity to straighten out some of his misunderstanding of that at that time, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, will the Treasurer please confirm that after all of that, whatever that was, that the Alberta Mortgage and Housing Corporation actually lost $288 million, and if he had accounted properly for its loan losses, would have lost as much as $700 or $800 million in the same year that it paid $420 million to the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund?
Well, once again, Mr. Speaker, the member from Meadowlark, when it's convenient, will suggest that the auditor is not doing his job, as he has now suggested. And when it's also to his convenience, Mr. Speaker, he will cite other points which will in fact show that we've ignored the auditor's report. What we've done, Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General of this legislature has looked at the Housing Corporation, has passed judgment upon it, has recognized the losses, as have all other financial organizations, including those Crown agencies, recognized losses, driven primarily as a result of less than adequate economic performance and downturn in real estate values. Mr. Speaker, that's being recognized, and that's a significant adjustment as well.
Speaking of the Auditor General, will the Treasurer please confirm, therefore, why it is that the Auditor General is not happy with the accounting principles that Alberta Mortgage and Housing is using at the direction of the Treasurer, and that, in fact, we can't trust the books, and, in fact, you have lost more money than the books say?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, the member from Betalark is always taking convenient shots at the Heritage Fund. Now, let's remember one thing about the Heritage Fund, Mr. Speaker. That fund is well over $15 billion in assets, has $13 billion in financial assets, Mr. Speaker, and is now transferring something like $1.3 billion to the General Revenue Fund to reduce taxation and provide major services to senior citizens for educational purposes for health facilities. Unparalleled, Mr. Speaker, in Canada, and a model that other jurisdictions are looking to. Naturally, Mr. Speaker, there have been some problems. I remember when Premier Lougheed introduced the legislation to put the Heritage Fund in place, Mr. Speaker, he said a government that wants action has to take some risk. Mr. Speaker, we took the action. We saved that money for future generations, and now it's working to the availability and advantage of all Albertans. A significant understudy, Mr. Speaker, he should look at that model because it is an amazing success story, Mr. Speaker, and he can't deny it.
If you want to look at successful models.
Betalark, when that person's leader has finished.
If you want to look at successful models, perhaps the Treasurer should consider Alaska, Saskatchewan, and Quebec, in fact. Will the Treasurer please admit that since taxpayers' money subsidizes losses on Crown Corporation, that in fact Albertans are digging into their pockets to pay the return, to subsidize Alberta Mortgage and Housing so that it in turn can pay $420 million to the Heritage Savings and Trust Fund, and in fact 25% at least of those earnings are absolutely meaningless.
Having listened at great length to that succinct supplementary, the buzzer is still gone. The time for question period has expired. Might we complete this series of questions after unanimous consent? Opposed? Provincial Treasurer.
Mr. Speaker, there are a series of investments in the Heritage Fund which are those investments which flow through to the Crown corporations of this province. Corporations which at the time, as I have explained, were used to pursue economic objectives, to assess particular sectors, and we used the resources available in this province to do just that. Now, as we've indicated, Mr. Speaker, we did it at a time when there was a need and a demand. And instead of turning to offshore resources, for example, at a time when the Canadian dollar was under some peril and the energy scenario was difficult for the world, we used the internal resources of this province, Mr. Speaker, to diversify the economy, to drive certain sectors, including housing, agriculture, and to some extent the telecommunications expansions, generating jobs, Mr. Speaker, generating economic development, and doing all that, Mr. Speaker, without increasing by 1 cent the tax load in the province of Alberta. That's an amazing story, Mr. Speaker, and that's one that all Albertans understand, and it's too bad that he can't see the advantage of that fund right now, Mr. Speaker.
Edmonton Kingsway, followed by Red Deer South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the mess in the relationship between this Crown Corporation, the Alberta Mortgage and Housing Corporation that is, and the Heritage Trust Fund, and the mess that the corporation itself is in, to the Premier or the Minister of Municipal Affairs, will you call a judicial inquiry into the whole Alberta Municipal Housing Corporation?
Mr. Speaker, to leave the impression that there is something in terms of mismanagement or something as serious to require a public inquiry is in fact misleading the House and misleading all Albertans, Mr. Speaker, and of course we will not have an inquiry.
Red Deer South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary to the Treasurer. Could he advise the Legislative Assembly, please, what percentage of the 86-87 budget will be funded as a direct result of the earnings of the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund?
Mr. Speaker, that's exactly a very important point to lead, Mr. Speaker. We tend to forget, Mr. Speaker, how important that Heritage Fund has been over the past decade. And as I've indicated earlier, approximately $8.3 billion has already been transferred from the income earned within that fund to the General Revenue Fund to assist us in terms of providing the high services and low tax. As I indicated this year, Mr. Speaker, the transfer will be $1.3 billion. That is a very large percentage of the total revenue. It probably allows us, Mr. Speaker, to avoid imposing a sales tax. Now, I know that our colleagues across the way would probably argue in favor of a sales tax, but we want to protect the low-income individuals in this province, Mr. Speaker, and one way to do it is to maximize the use of that fund, and this government is doing just that, Mr. Speaker.
Orders of the day.
Committee of Supply.